Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another movie review. And today's review is a film that came out a little over 6 years ago. Came out in December '06, so it just recently celebrated its 6-year anniversary. And it is the fourth film, directed by Mel Gibson. And of the four, it's the second one that he did not star in, because the first two he directed, Man Without a Face and Braveheart, he also starred in. And Passion of the Christ was the first one he didn't star in. And as of right now, this is the last film he's directed, which I really want to see him get more work, but as a director. But if this is the last film he directs, he went out sort of on top with direction, I will say, because I really did enjoy this movie. It, of course, is the 2006 epic action-adventure film Apocalypto. Now, to start things off, I do not recognize any of the actors in this movie, even though, from what I read, a couple of them, or at least one of them, is in a movie that I know of, and that, of course, is our main villain, who is played by Raul Trujillo. I always have trouble with some of these names. Trujillo. I recognize him from, apparently he had a minor role in Highlander 3, and then of course he was in Cowboys and Aliens as Black Knife. Then he was in the miniseries from 2011, Moby Dick, and then also Neverland, so I recognize him from there. I thought he looked familiar though, even though he has sort of an elaborate costume at first, but anyway, back to the thing. The movie was nominated for 3 Academy Awards, hence it's in this series. It was nominated for Best Makeup, Best Sound Editing, and Best Sound Mixing. Those last technical ones, I don't really know much about them, but I could see probably where they got nominated. Makeup, I really do agree with, because the makeup effects in this movie, they're not very elaborate ones. It's more so the costume that's more elaborate than the makeup effects. But looking at them, I could see why the Academy would say that they should be nominated. Now, before I get into the film, I gotta let everyone know, if you haven't seen this movie, it might be a hard movie for some people to get into. And the main reason is the fact that the film's not in English. It is in the Mayan language, which, if you don't like reading subtitles or can't really get into movies outside your native language, unless they're dubbed, you might not want to watch this movie just for that. But if you can try to look past it, I'd say you're going to like this film. I mean, my older brother Joseph recommended it. The history teacher I have for this semester recommended it. Partially because as I record this video, we're actually discussing the early part of American history, you know, pre-colonial meetings with the natives. So we're going through the theory of all that about civilization and everything, and that's one thing that this movie does kind of analyze in a way, which is why she recommended it. It analyzes the notion of civilization, but it does it in a way where it doesn't like force it in, you know, like for example, I mentioned this a lot, Machete with the border. It like pushes it in your face to where it's almost in the whole camera, like get that border hopper out of here, stuff like that. Whereas in this movie, it's kind of in the background. It's in there with the story, and you could see it, but it's in the background, which I will get that in all in due time. Now the plot is that we start off seeing a hunter-gatherer society where we have our main character, Jaguar Paw. He has his father, Flint Sky. He has a younger brother who we see that they haze a little bit, you know, through a hunter haze, partially because him and his wife have not been able to have children yet. And we get to like this society. We get to see them a little bit. You know, they're simple and stuff. I guess you could say how some of the other Native American tribes, more up north and probably south into South America, would have been. So you get a feel for them. And then the next morning after we see them, Jaguar Paw awakens from a nightmare to see a warrior entering his village and setting the huts on fire. And then of course more come in and we find out it's a raid. And of course it's it's led by Zero Wolf, who is our main villain. And they attack and subdue the villagers. Jaguar Paw manages to get his wife and their son, Turtles Run, into a safe place, but then he is captured and all the people that have not been killed are taken, and they're slowly tracked through the jungle and everything until they are brought to a Mayan city, where we find out that a good portion of them are going to be sold into slavery, and the rest of them are going to be sacrificed. And And of course, I'm not going to do a lot of spoilers, but somehow Jaguar Paw manages to escape it. It's through a whole prophecy thing I'm not going to spoil, which this prophecy thing does kind of tie into the Spanish conquistadors arriving, but I'm not going to spoil how. But it was an interesting one. If you know your history, the moment you hear the prophecy, you're going to be like, oh, I think I get it. And the rest of the movie is based until the end. From after he escapes the sacrifice to the end of the movie, it's basically Jaguar Paw trying to survive as he's being chased by some Mayan soldiers through the woods and stuff, and then of course the ending. But as I mentioned earlier, just about a minute ago, part of the movie is about looking closely at civilizations. Now, what I meant by it was that the first civilization that we see in the movie, of course, is a hunter-gatherer society, and then of course the society that takes them is a more advanced society. What I mean by that is that we don't see a lot of it, but we see that they have a grand city, they have a big population, they seem to have grand architecture, and of course, if you know your history, you also know they had a lot of mathematics, they had, dang it, what's the words? Irrigation, they had irrigation. We see some of the crops and stuff that they have. They had games and stuff. And of course, they had massive religious structures as we see in the movie. So we see that it's a bigger civilization. And even at the end, even though it's not shown in the movie, if you know history, you know what's going to happen after the conquistadors land. So it's a little bit of that. Is that, and the way that the Mayans in the movie look down on the hunter-gatherers and just use them as cannon fodder for their rituals and for their slavery stuff. So in turn, would the Spanish conquistadors look down on the Mayans, even though the Mayans technically are a civilization, but not by the standards of the European conquistadors. And of course, as a side note, that's one of the reasons I look forward to the history class I'm in, because we're going to be examining history through lenses like that, bias and all that, which is why so far I've had a fun time, and which is why I decided to watch this movie when it was recommended. Because if you look at it through the thing of civilization, it makes for an interesting watch, and that's why after watching the movie and reading up on the controversy surrounding it, I'm like, what? Like, for example, here's some of the controversy. Part of it was the representation of the Maya as super cruel, to quote William Booth of the Washington Post, as the super cruel, psycho-sadistic society on the skids, a ghoulscape engaged in widespread slavery, reckless sewage treatment, and bad rave dancing with a real lust for human blood. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of them, but that kind of sums up the whole thing about it. And I can understand why people, especially if they're more so descended from the culture, would kind of be offended by the representation here. But I didn't really have a problem with it. I mean, we're not going to see all of the Mayan society in the movie, so that's kind of one flaw in the whole argument. We're just going to see parts of it. And we only do see the parts of it that are relevant to the story. Because remember, even though it's examining culture, the main story focus is the character of Jaguar Paw. We have to see what he sees. We're not going to see everything. We're just going to see what him and the other people see. And this is what they see. Like if it had shown the society before they arrived, we probably would have seen them in a different light. But also the fact is the Mayans are the bad guys of the movie, because Jaguar Paw's our hero, so someone who does something bad to him is obviously going to be our villain, so we have to look at that too. And also the fact is, since they are the so-called, since the hunter-gatherers are the so-called inferior society, at least through the eyes of the Mayans, they of course are going to look down on them, and, as I said, see them nothing more as cannon fodder, which is the same thing that the Spanish conquistadors, if I could get the word right, did later. So it's looking at it through that. And now one thing I would give them is that the Mayan society at the time in real life that the events would have taken place was fully collapsed and everything, and the society the conquistadors met were actually small societies under the ban of the Aztec Empire. But after thinking about it for a little bit, I thought of this, especially considering that the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is human sacrifice, presented in the movie is more like the Aztec. Here's what I thought about. Maybe the people that we see in the city, most of the ones are Mayan, but they're under the Aztec banner. Like maybe the priests and something are Aztec, and there are some Aztec people spread throughout. but the majority of the people in the city are Mayan, which is why they're speaking in Mayan, and also why they use a Mayan god. Maybe they, in the locally, they integrated it into the religious structure, because I know some religions would do that. Maybe it's just me thinking of it, but that's what I think anyway. Now, the human sacrifice element, for the same thing. Even though the Mayans did practice human sacrifice, the way we see it in the movie is more like how the Aztec did it. Widespread human sacrifice. This, ripping up, cutting open the chest and ripping the heart out while it was still beating, as George Carlin called it, theater. But that's more the Aztec one, so see my previous comment. And then, of course, the ending. The ending, some people got offended by that because it's all like, the Mayans are so they're so bad. We got the colonists have to come to help them and everything. I don't really see it that way. I think it's more the whole civilization thing, and part of this is tied in with a quote that we see at the very beginning of the movie. A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within. That is true. Most civilizations don't disintegrate just from an outside force. They sometimes will destroy themselves from within. And I'm talking about great civilizations, big civilizations, not like small groups. Like if we were to talk about the Native Americans that lived in North America, they were destroyed morally from an outside force. And it wasn't just the Europeans, it was the diseases that the Europeans came. Because I'll stay right here. From what I've learned in history, if the Native Americans had the immunity to European diseases that they have now, with the numbers they had then, even with guns, at least early on, the colonists would have been screwed. You can look at that. You can look at that just from the battle that happened when the conquistadors actually did make it to the center of the Aztec civilization. They had to retreat. The only reason the conquistadors eventually defeated the Aztecs was because they had made so many enemies within their own empire. The people joined the conquistadors, and that's why we have no more Aztecs. So that's the real life version of the Aztecs destroying themselves from within. They took so many slaves, conquered so many people, made so many people hate them that in their delusions of grandeur, they destroyed themselves. They collapsed slowly. They collapsed quick, but not like a flathead cupboard where they went slowly. They collapsed, very quickly. Well, at least after everything was said and done, I guess you'd say it's really quickly. But the ending, like I said, it's a very subtle thing about, like I mentioned earlier, the Aztecs / Mayans looking down on the hunter-gatherers. So that in the ending, we get a subtle thing of they're going to in turn be looked down at by the colonists, by the Europeans. And I don't really see it as being offensive or racist. But then again, that's just me. Maybe it's because I don't really get offended by all that stuff, unless it's something that is just really super offensive. It's just like one of those ridiculous things. You're like, really, I cannot believe that happened. Like a certain movie that will remain nameless, but involves the city where my good friend Jeffrey lives. That's all I'm gonna say about it. You guys don't know what movie I'm talking about. But anyway, my rating for Apocalypto is 4.5 out of 5. It's a pretty good movie. I could see myself watching it. Maybe not all the time. I'd probably have to be in the mood for it, but it's a pretty good movie. It's not a biopic, so there is some creative license taken at points, but I thought it showed the whole civilization thing in an interesting manner, especially since you're doing it from the perspective of a culture that actually was conquered and destroyed for the whole civilization argument. So for there, it's an interesting. Deserved the Academy Award nominations it got. Surprised it didn't get more, but that's just me. Mel Gibson, wonderful direction. The acting is pretty good. Now, James Horner's score I thought was fitting of the film, and the movie made back its budget. It made $121 million on a $40 million budget, so it made back its movie. It's only a little more than 2 hours, and it moves pretty quickly, I thought. But anyway, do I recommend it? Yes, if you're into movies like this, or if you've been wanting to see it for curiosity, I recommend it.